Hello everyone, and welcome to the third part in the series of videos exploring qualitative coding. My name is Amir Mikhailovich, and I'm a consultant for UBC Library Research Commons on computer-assisted qualitative data analysis, otherwise known as CACDAS. In this video, we will look at some tips from a selected body of literature for qualitative coding, especially in computer-assisted qualitative data analysis. Our objectives for this video are to consider what might guide us as we develop our codes in qualitative data analysis, how we might reflect on codes as we develop them in order to move the analysis forward, and what we might consider when reviewing our codes. Let's start with this useful list of guides that we can use to help direct our coding process. This list comes from Coffey's book, Doing Ethnography. She suggested that our research questions could be highly useful for guiding our coding. We actually saw that in the part 2 video in this series when we explored one of the sample projects in vivo. But we know that in qualitative analysis, our research questions may change as we conduct our analysis based on the patterns emerging from our data. In such situations, it is still useful to have our study's goals guide our coding, so that we don't code for everything and lose sight of our focus. Published studies in our area of research can also be very instructive in terms of ideas for what we could look for in the data, especially during the stages of analysis when we want to move from more substantive coding toward theoretical coding, as we discussed in the first part of this series. This would also include consulting with existing theoretical or conceptual frameworks that we might not have considered previously when we just started coding. Lastly, concepts and terms used by participants in our study can be very instructive and useful as guides for our coding. When we use participants' terms as the labels of codes, we often call those codes in vivo codes. Importantly, it is not only the concepts themselves that we should consider, but also how participants perceive those concepts' relationships with each other. Moving on to the idea of reflecting while coding, I can share that I met quite a few people who developed neat code lists but had no idea what to do with them. The common denominator for all of those people was that they didn't sufficiently reflect on their analysis and consider the coding process as sufficient. Reflection while you are doing your coding is key for moving your analysis forward. You can do this in a memo in your chosen CACDAS package, as you can see here in this image from the memo section in vivo. As you do your coding, reflect on the following things as Jackson and Baisley suggested in their book. Where might you be excited about potentially contributing to your field? Reflect on this. If you are feeling bored, stop and take a break. Reflect on how you have or have not changed your mind about your codes. Write about how your coding changes and shifts as you continue the analysis. This will support you later on when you're asked to explain how you reduce the volume of unstructured data into the neat list of themes or specific patterns in discourse. Reflect on your moments of frustration as they happen. When you feel stuck or lose track of the relationship between your codes and your study's goal or research question, reflection in a memo will help you move toward resolving the issues. As you code, reflect on the patterns you identify while moving from a close perspective, for example, examining a particular participant, and a broader perspective, for example, examining a pattern across participants. Reflect on how adjusting your gaze and perspective influences your analysis or perception of emerging patterns. Reflect on how you build your ideas. As you employ descriptive labeling, always reflect on the directions these descriptive codes might take you. Why are they important? What does it mean that something keeps appearing in different places in the data? Try to move away from the descriptive level in a memo. Set the path for more conceptual or theoretical interpretations. Reflect on potential jumping to conclusions. Don't fall in love with ideas and judgments that come up early in the process. Make sure to always challenge your interpretations by looking for discrepant evidence, for example, across cases or contexts, and reflecting on this in a memo. Reflect on your patterns of overlaps between the multiple codes you apply. If, for example, you notice that you keep applying the same kinds of codes together, this will give you ideas about which directions to explore later through queries, what kinds of codes might intersect or relate to each other. And lastly, a piece of advice for reflection that comes from Silver and Lewins, who wrote a very instructive book on computer-assisted qualitative data analysis. Reflect on what appears to be missing from the data, that which is not apparent. Codes will reflect what is in the data, but it is also important to consider what might not be reflected in the data that otherwise could be, and why. Lastly, let's have a look at some additional tips from the literature about reviewing our codes. Lynn Richards, for example, suggested that we periodically monitor what we are coding, where, and why. Jackson and Baisley suggested that we periodically ask ourselves the following questions. What was said before or after this data segment? Do I want to code this same data segment somewhere else? Is this code too general or too specific? Has my understanding of this concept shifted? What Gibbs called definitional drift? Did I code too much or too little context? To what other codes is this data segment coded? With that, I'd like to thank you for tuning in to this third and last part of my series of videos about qualitative coding. Take care and happy qualitative coding!